couple of nights ago, I watched Collateral Murder and listened to Ethan McCord speaking about his role in that incident. He found the badly injured children in the van, and the little girl had a stomach wound and her face was covered in glass, and he tried to pick the glass out of her eyes. McCord said killing unarmed civilians daily, often including children, that's just what happened. And there were far worse incidents. Like most service personnel, he came from a poor background, and he went to war to defend America and American values, and instead found they were committing crimes against humanity. He came home severely traumatised. This is what the 2010 WikiLeaks releases revealed, the truth about the horrendous civilian casualties in that war. It was Collateral Murder that first captured the world's attention and is the most potent reminder of why Julian Assange is in Belmarsh today, why he sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy, why he was stripped of asylum and dragged from the embassy, and why the US is seeking his extradition on charges that attract a sentence of 175 years that will see him die in prison. This indictment doesn't cover any of the publications after 2010. Julian Assange was a young, courageous, clever, idealistic Australian who believed that those in power should be held to account. He understood that democracy requires the empowerment of people, and that information and truth were central to that, and he understood the potential of digital technology to facilitate this, and developed an ingenious way for whistleblowers to upload material anonymously. Well, not since the Pentagon Papers had there been such shocking revelations, but this new threat to government control of the narrative was greater because it was open-ended. The potential was therefore inestimable ongoing damage to that narrative by those compelled to blow the whistle on lies and injustice. WikiLeaks heralded a new era of increased transparency, harnessing the internet's capacity to strengthen our democracy. In 2010, WikiLeaks followed Collateral Murder with the Afghan and Iraq war logs and the diplomatic cables. The latter, the cables, showing how US strategic objectives facilitate the creation of a global economic order that enables US corporations to do as they wish. There's an excellent new book about the significance of the cables by Clinton Fernandez, Professor of International and Political Studies, which examines the significance of the cables. So Afghanistan, North Korea, Iraq, you name it, including background on the crisis to Iran and China today, as well as treaties, the purpose of them, who benefits and how, and what the big ticket items are. Intellectual property rights sounds really innocuous, but actually it's often about who gets to live and die, who gets to live a healthy life because of access to generic drugs. In 2016, WikiLeaks published the DNC emails and revealed that the DNC manipulated American democracy by cheating Bernie Sanders of his rightful nomination. This was followed by Vault 7, the CIA's digital bag of tricks, including half a dozen scripts, and including Cyrillic script, that allow it to hack into devices and servers with a fake foreign identity. It is indeed what they feared, a tsunami of revelations, which was endless, about almost every government in the world, most of all about the United States, actions and motivations and the truth behind their public narrative, thanks to a courageous whistleblower, Chelsea Manning. The documents initially couldn't be ignored. They provided material for countless stories, countless organisations around the world, about war crimes and the wrongdoing of governments and multinational corporations. WikiLeaks and Julian personally received scores of journalism awards and human rights awards. Now, the Australian journalist, editor and publisher faces political prosecution and the prospect of dying in a US prison, with no support from his government, from most journalists, certainly in this country, or publishers in Australia, or the Australian public. and this despite the enormous overreach of the prosecution under a domestic espionage law. Look, he's been indicted and they wish to extradite him. He's a non-US citizen for alleged crimes committed outside the United States, and therefore the dire repercussions are there for press freedom worldwide. If successful, any journalist anywhere who publishes American secrets can be arrested, extradited, tried and imprisoned in the United States. The most frequent question I'm asked is why is there so little support from the government, from journalists and from the public? And I'd like to start with the easiest one to answer, the government, which has abrogated its responsibility. Yet in the past it's intervened to secure the release of Peter Greste, of James Ricketson, who's with us here tonight, and Peter Wallace and Steve Pratt. However, none of those people were wanted by the US government. James is a palpably decent human being. He's urging us to recognise Julian's political prosecution and urging the government to protect him. Incredibly, and in an unbelievable lack of generosity, having been rescued himself, Peter Greste has firmly and sanctimoniously shut the door behind him, quibbling over whether Julian is a real journalist or a responsible one. Care Australia workers Pratt and Wallace were convicted in 1999 by a Belgrade court of espionage. Both had military backgrounds, they were tracking military movements in a conflict zone, and as head of Care Australia, Malcolm Fraser, was to discover, to his horror, were also on the payroll of a NATO country, thereby placing at risk all aid operations everywhere, all aid workers under suspicion everywhere, and particularly in the area where they worked, a country that desperately needed assistance. The Australian government did everything in its power to get them out of jail and ensured that SBS did not run the story until they were out of jail. All these cases were resolved through political intervention. I was told by a Labor elder that even if Julian was here at home, no Australian government of any persuasion would refuse to send him to the United States. We have a treaty with the United States, as does the UK, and protests, well, so be it. They'll achieve nothing. All extradition treaties have out clauses, of course, but our government has a real problem standing up to the United States. Another reason for the government's lack of support is that recapturing control of the official narrative suits all governments, really. The US led a new charge against whistleblowers under Obama, and now there's an attempt to criminalise publication. The Australian government followed fast on the heels of Julian's indictment and extradition requests, with raids on the ABC and on another journalist. Recent whistleblower prosecutions include Richard Boyle, Peter Cade, his lawyer David Colery, David McBride, who is also being prosecuted for revealing what they were getting up to in Afghanistan. It's impossible to stop new people coming forward. It seems that some people's moral compass is such that they'll speak up despite the personal repercussions. So our government similarly is trying to rein in the fourth estate, aiming to intimidate future whistleblowers, journalists and publishers. Thirdly, governments only do things they'd rather not do when placed under enormous public pressure, and that pressure simply isn't there. And I'll look at why in a moment. Following the instant protests from journalists and publishers around Australia over the two Australian Federal Police raids, a third was called off and an inquiry into press freedom was announced. So, pressure works a treat. Incredibly, despite the fact that there's an Australian publisher in a high security prison for journalistic activity in the UK, there was no mention of Julian in any of these protests around the country. There was no mention of Julian in any public discourse about press freedom, including at the National Press Club, where 3 senior Australian journalists spoke. Why aren't journalists supportive? Well, one reason is the notion that Julian isn't a real journalist. He's just a ratbag and somehow deserves what's happened to him. Another is that there's a default position. We tend to follow the leader in journalism, and there's safety in numbers. On the whole, the mainstream media sing from the same songbook, and that's evident in the selection of stories, the angle that the stories take. And at the end of the day, we check that our program's pretty much similar to what everyone else is doing. Pat ourselves on the back and clock off. Affirmation couldn't possibly have gotten anything wrong because everyone's running the same thing. So the guiding principle is sameness. And there's a shared and simple perspective of the world. There's the axis of evil, and all those countries belonging in the axis of evil, their actions and motivations are evil, and our allies, of course, our actions and motivations are implicitly, inherently good. Julian has dared to do something that no one else would. The volume and nature of the revelations were impossible to ignore. He became a public figure, a global public figure, and WikiLeaks continued to reveal how power is in fact exercised and in whose service. But following the period of the war revelations, the mainstream media reset coverage back to normal, back to the songbook, buying the story that he's a narcissist, possibly a racist, finally able to ignore the revelations, dismissing Julian as a tool of the Russians who interfered in the US election. The traditional media have enjoyed the privilege of being gatekeepers of information, and evident in the Guardian editor Rusbridge's reference to Assange's narcissism, that Julian dared to think he was going to share control in their partnership over what happens to the material. Rusbridge, of course, is oblivious to his own arrogance, an enormous arrogance, which is not uncommon around who controls information, who decides what the public know and see. We're often spared, we members of the public, I've got that hat on now, the visceral reality of what's happening because someone decides it's not really palatable while we're having dinner. The only problem is that the same footage is used in the late evening bulletins. So I don't know who made that excuse up, but it's still being used. But the digital technology has revolutionised our access to information and democratised journalism. These days, any member of the public can capture an atrocity and put it up on the internet, and they do daily. There's been a massive change in the environment mainstream media operates in, causing some discomfort because there's no longer a monopoly on the filtering of information. The specific accusation that some releases have caused harm, I'll deal with in a moment, but the contempt for Julian and the criticism of not being a journalist just because he doesn't have a degree in journalism, as I don't, and as others who produce the work of journalists don't, is a very convenient way to isolate him. Julian has a more sophisticated understanding of geopolitics than most of his detractors put together. He appreciates the nuances and complexity of geopolitics more than most of the journalists that I've worked with. Furthermore, he exposes the important questions that they're not asking and their failure to hold power to account. WikiLeaks not only publishes material in the utmost public interest, its editor doesn't have a paternalistic attitude towards the public. Working in a TV newsroom is where you see contempt for the public, or the punters, as they're referred to. We decide what you need to know and interpret it for you because only we have been trained to do so. Actually, when I was presenting World News, I was well aware that among our audience were people who knew a lot more about the topic than we did, and they were either laughing hysterically or wanted to throw a brick through the TV. Unfortunately, The media have also been very cleverly used in Julian's persecution, used to discredit him, and this has been very important because it's ensured that he doesn't have public support. The media have been used to constantly reinforce three messages with insidious impact. First, he's a narcissist trying to avoid rape charges. Secondly, people have died as a result of his 2010 releases. Third, that he was used by Russia and responsible for Trump's election. And I'd like to quickly address each of those things. Julian has never been charged with rape. The definition of rape in Swedish law is such that it need not necessarily involve any aggression or even any coercion. The women had no intention of reporting him for anything. They went to the police because one of them wanted to find out if he could be forced to have an HIV test. This woman, who initiated the police visit, in fact refused to sign the statement the police prepared for her and was distressed that this had become the outcome of this visit. There's a book of transcripts of the police interrogations, remarkably in Sweden, very easy to obtain under FOI, and they were published in a book in 2013. Julian has wanted to clear his name and has never refused to go to Sweden. All he's wanted is a guarantee that they would not extradite him to the United States. And we have to remember that Sweden has been involved with the CIA in renditions. So he had very good reason to be asking for this guarantee, which was refused. He offered to be interviewed then for years in London before it was finally accepted. But he still hasn't been charged because there's no evidence to warrant it. The case has been closed and reopened umpteen times by umpteen prosecutors. Julian sought refuge in the embassy for fear of political prosecution in the United States. 7 years later, Ecuador and the United Kingdom broke international law, stripped him of asylum and dragged him from the embassy. And the US immediately served the UK with an extradition request. And lest we're tempted to think, oh my goodness, this is what it's always been about. He was right. Up pops reliable Sweden again to remind everyone he's still a wanted man there, knowing that he may never have the opportunity to clear his name and knowing that they don't have a basis on which to charge him. Anne Ramberg, until recently, the head of the Swedish Bar Association, put a very courageous statement up on their website, which I think now has been removed. I can't find it, and she's no longer the head of the association, but she said that Sweden and the UK had behaved appallingly in this matter, that Swedish prosecutors were basically bringing the Swedish justice system into disrepute, and that Assange was being persecuted for exposing war crimes and had performed an enormous service to the public. Regarding the question of harm, 60 Minutes recently trotted out Jim Moland, who again was allowed to repeat claims that are false. There are 2 internal ADF reports. They're available on the internet. They're quoted extensively in this book by Professor Clinton Fernandez, that one of these reports was commissioned by Julia Gillard, and Jim Moland's very well aware of these reports. They concluded that no one was harmed, no Australian soldier, no Afghan or Iraqi collaborator. The only thing that the documents that were published did was embarrass the government. Though it was established at Bradley Manning's military hearing that no one was harmed, no American either, was harmed as a result of the publications, the former Assistant Secretary of State claimed on Four Corners recently that people died. And despite that there have been no reports to substantiate this at all, he wasn't challenged. This very serious claim was allowed to stand without substantiation. And while we're on Four Corners, They also used a grab at former Prime Minister Gillard, making her false claim that what Julian had done was illegal. Very soon after, the head of the Australian Federal Police corrected her, saying that Julian had broken no law. Another error they made was to say he was wanted for sex crimes. No, it has not been established that any crime was committed. On the other hand, the UN rapporteur of the torture, who said, in 20 years of my work with victims of war, violence and political persecution, I've never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonise and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law. No mention of this on Four Corners, nor of Bill Mills's warning against sending Julian to the United States, where he says he would not receive a fair trial, he'd be tortured and he'd die in a US prison. Instead, Four Corners trotted out Hillary Clinton and peddled the Russiagate line, which I'll deal with in a second. For an investigative program, Four Corners repeated a series of false or unsubstantiated statements and revealed nothing new. The story, hero or villain, channeled the lowbrow and fueled prejudice. The tone was set and reinforced with the repetition of a cheap, transparent and ridiculous device, a facial morphing sequence, to remind us that this chameleon is untrustworthy, in case the repeated use of the word narcissist wasn't doing the job. You'd be forgiven for thinking that none of the rest of us cut our hair, grow a beard or grow old. Older, because he's not old. The final sentence in the story attributes blame to his activism for any clampdown on journalism that may ensue worldwide. So, the Four Corners verdict is pretty transparent. He's a villain. In my view, Australia's premier investigative program discredited itself by doing harm to its subject, a man whose life is already in danger, in contravention of the ABC's code of practice. The program's executive producer does nothing to dispel accusations of bias with her unprofessional tweets, and you can only afford to express such contempt openly when you're assured there'll be no repercussions. On being a tool of Russia, collaborating with Russia and publishing the DNC emails, manipulating the US election. WikiLeaks published material showing it was in fact the DNC who manipulated the election, but that message has been lost, overshadowed by the false accusations repeatedly trumpeted through the media and repeated on Four Corners. Extraordinary, despite the time allocated to Russiagate on Four Corners, no mention in the program of what was actually in the DNC emails. Julian would have indeed been manipulating the election if he'd withheld publication of that material. Would the same accusation have been made if the material was about Trump? And I think we all know the answer to that. There has never been any evidence that Julian colluded with the Russians. You wouldn't know about it, but last week, the whole Russian collusion story was demolished in a United States court. No collusion, Trump, no collusion, Assange, no collusion, Papadopoulos, no collusion, and a series of others. Never mind Mueller's wishy-washy report. Not only did the Clinton-appointed judge throw the DNC collusion case out, he said that the WikiLeaks publications were in the utmost public interest and deserved the strongest First Amendment protection. This is huge news. Has it been reported anywhere in the mainstream media? By the way, hip hip hooray for the First Amendment, which protects journalistic activity, quote, it doesn't seek to define who is or who isn't a journalist, acknowledging that it's all about the right to publish the truth. Finally, on the accusation that these documents came from the Russians, and here is where our premier investigative current affairs program might have revealed something to the public, ignored so far by the mainstream media. Four Corners could have interviewed William Binney, the former technical director of the NSA, who's largely responsible for developing NSA capability and understands it better than most. Binney says the emails could not possibly have been obtained via a hack. It was a download onto a storage device. This occurred on the east coast of America, and this is a fabrication. He provides a number of reasons for this and proof. This information is available on independent investigative journalism websites. We await the findings now of the investigation by the US Attorney General into how President Trump says the Russiagate conspiracy was manufactured. Media bias is the biggest hurdle to the defence of Julian's human rights. He's fair game because he's been disowned by journalists and he's in turn disowned by the public. In failing Julian, the press is failing itself. Certainly in Australia, there's little awareness of the repercussions for press freedom should his conviction be successful. And to this matter, Four Corners devoted exactly 4.5 minutes at the end of a 1 3/4 hour program. I travelled to London twice to see Julian. First time with Professor Stuart Rees, who suggested that we present him with the Sydney Peace Foundation Medal. So off we went in 2011 and presented him a medal for his exceptional courage in pursuit of human rights. It was at the Frontline Club, and at the time, if I recall correctly, he only had a few hours during the day when he was free to move around. In 2013, concerned about his predicament, I travelled to London and spent 3 days with him and his team in the Ecuadorian embassy, where this small, smart, capable, dedicated team were developing a sophisticated portal for the public to access the vast trove of documents with commentary that contextualised the information and cross-referencing. I sat in on meetings with Julian, with people from around the world, and so many people who don't know Julian have an opinion about him, his personality and his motivations. Julian is he's an individual that's completely absorbed by an enormous undertaking. He's trying to redress the imbalance in power between citizens and the state. I observed him to be completely oblivious to the effect he has on young women. All to matters irrelevant in his head. The rape allegations are disgracefully being used to discredit him, and it's frankly an insult to victims of rape. Julian is being destroyed for revealing war crimes, and we need to stand up for his human rights and against his political persecution.